We are very, very delighted that so many of you could join us today for this special webinar with Dr. Dale Lund, who I will introduce in just a minute. I'm also joined today by Greg Link, Aging Services Program Specialist in the Office for Community-Based Services at the U.S. Administration on Aging. He's also the Federal Program Officer for the Lifespan Respite Program. As well as Sean Coffey, who's with the National Center on Caregiving at the Family Caregiver Alliance in San Francisco. And the Family Caregiver Alliance is our co-host for this event. ARCH is very honored to be partnering with Family Caregiver Alliance to bring you our joint effort through the Technical Assistance Centers on Caregiving and Lifespan Respite Programs. And this effort is funded by the U.S. Administration on Aging. First, I'd like to turn it over to Greg Link to say a few words of welcome. Greg?
Thank you, Jill, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this webinar. As Jill said, I'm the Federal Project Officer at AOA for the Lifespan Respite Care Program, as well as for the National Family Caregiver Support Program. And I think this particular topic, making respite more effective, is particularly timely. As I know, many of the Year 1 and some of the Year 2 grantees are working through their grants under the Lifespan Respite Care Program to deliver respite care services. And one of the hallmarks of AOA's initiatives in recent years is to deliver services and develop models for service delivery that are research-based and that we can ensure that they are effective. And so I think the information that you'll be hearing today from Dr. Lund will help you as you develop your lifespan respite care programs and identify those services that will be delivered in a most effective way. So I'm looking forward to the information that's presented. And as always, I look forward to working with the grantees and the stakeholders in each of the states that we're working with. Jill?
Thank you. Sean with the Family Caregiver Alliance and our co-host for the webinar will also present us with a quick welcome.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Jill, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Like Jill said, my name is Sean Coffey, and I work at the National Center on Caregiving at Family Caregiver Alliance. We're located in San Francisco and have worked for over 30 years to improve the quality of life for family caregivers through direct services, research, public awareness, and advocacy. We are really excited to be partnering in this webinar with our colleagues at ARCH National Respite Network and Resource Center. The Technical Assistance Centers for Caregiver Programs and Lifespan Respite both support the Aging Network and respite programs that they are better equipped to serve older adults and their caregivers. The centers provide access to practical tools and multimedia, maintain 2 robust websites with national databases of respite and model caregiver support programs and materials, write policy updates, sponsor specialized trainings, and provide individualized technical support. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Jill.
Thank you, Sean. For those of you who are not familiar with ARCH or with Lifespan Respite Programs, I just wanted to share some very brief background on both. ARCH is charged with providing training and TA to the currently 24 state agency Lifespan Respite grantees and their partners, including the 35 state respite coalitions, as well as other respite providers and community and faith-based agencies. We also assist family caregivers in finding respite payment resources and providers through our National Respite Locator service, and we welcome all of you to our webinar today as well. Grants to states for lifespan respite are used specifically by states to help build or enhance coordinated systems that will help families, regardless of the age or condition of the care recipient, access affordable and quality respite options. We've been offering a continuing series of webinars, which are, as I mentioned earlier, are all archived on our website, in an effort to promote statewide lifespan respite systems, as well as to help expand respite capacity and accessibility in local communities across the country. We also have quite a bit of information that's available to the public, generally through our respite fact sheets, our issue briefs, and when possible, state site visits and ongoing TA resources and help that we can provide via email and telephone. Since our inception in 1990, ARCH has been working and disseminating best practices in respite services to ensure that all family caregivers have safe and meaningful respite experiences. We're especially pleased then to have Dr. Dale Lund with us today, who is an expert in this field and has been doing continuous research to help promote best practice. Dr. Lund is professor and chair of the sociology department at California State University, San Bernardino, California, and was formerly with the University of Utah. He has been conducting national and local studies on family caregiving since 1983. These studies identify the most common and difficult problems and satisfactions that caregivers experience, their use of services, and the potential of respite to be able to continue many of their lifelong interests. He's nationally and internationally known for his research, publications, and presentations focused on the ways older adults adjust to major life transitions, as well as family caregiving to persons with dementia. He served on the executive board of the Utah Alzheimer's Association, including 2 years as its president, and on the Strategic Planning Committee for the National Alzheimer's Association. His caregiving research has been funded by the Administration on Aging, the Bureau of Health Professions, the National Center for Nursing Research, and the National Alzheimer's Association. He has published over 100 journals and book chapters, and is the editor of 2 books, Older Bereaved Spouses and Men Coping with Grief. He's the recipient of numerous teaching, community service, and research awards. And we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Lund.
Thanks very much. And
you control now of the mouse. And you may proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. First I'd like to say my thanks to ARCH and the Family Caregiver Alliance for inviting me to make this presentation. I was just telling Jill earlier this morning how I much prefer making these kinds of presentations to community groups and caregivers because they seem to be more receptive and more eager to learn from the research findings than sometimes when we make presentations to other research colleagues. So this is a fantastic opportunity for me. A couple of preparatory comments before I get into the topics too. As my description indicates, most of my background here is regarding having conducted research on family caregivers, and I got started back in 1983 with funding from the Administration on Aging to do a large national study of caregivers where we obtained information from almost 1,000 caregivers living in 16 different states throughout the United States. Nearly every region of the country was included. At that time, my interest was moderate, maybe at best, but as I got more involved in the research, I learned the significant problems that family caregivers were experiencing and started to identify ways that I think research could help caregivers do a more effective job. So that large study back in the early 1980s really has led to an entire research career on the topic of family caregiving, and definitely in the direction of doing more research on the use of respite, which personally I believe is probably the single most important service that family caregivers can make use of. Secondly, as a preparatory comment, while most of my research has been on family caregivers to people who are older adults, as I compare our findings with research that's been done with adults caring for children, there's an awful lot of consistency in the findings and the application. So I think for those of you whose work is primarily in the arena of providing respite for people who care for younger children, I think you'll find that most of what I have to say is highly relevant. And then the final comment is that in this presentation, I have about 17 different slides that I will go through. some of the slides I will be skipping over rather quickly, and I did that on purpose so that I had more information available for those of you who would like to go back after the presentation and make additional reference use of some of the information that's on these slides. So basically, don't feel badly if I skip through some of the slides more quickly than others. The 4 primary topics that I plan to address today. Number 1 is, why do we need to focus on making respite more effective? Secondly, explain why research has not yet been found to have what I call whopper benefits to caregivers. There's a lot of disappointment among the research community as well as the providers that a large number of research studies have not found the benefits that everyone expected. And so I think during the course of this presentation I can answer why that's the case, and certainly there's a great deal of promise in the future if we ask the right questions. Number 3 is to provide my suggestions for how to make respite more effective, which is where my research now is focused in providing interventions for caregivers and instructions and guidance about how to make selections for what they do during respite time, and then to examine their outcomes. And then finally, my suggestions, at least briefly, for policy and future research and program evaluation. Okay, the first question, why focus on making respite more effective? On the slide, the top point is to enhance the quality of life of caregivers, families, and care recipients. Another way to address this particular topic is to ask the question, how stressful is family caregiving? In addition to doing research on family caregiving, I've spent a lot of time doing research on the ways in which older adults cope with the death of a spouse in later life. And those of you who are somewhat familiar with the grief and bereavement literature and widowhood, and also the research that came out years ago on stressful life events, most of that research after a couple of decades concluded that widowhood was perhaps the single greatest stressful event that people would ever experience in their lives. When we asked our bereavement research participants whether or not their widowhood experience was the most stressful situation they've ever been in, we found that 72% of the widows said that, widows and widowers, said that that was in fact the most stressful event they've ever experienced. When I got started in the family caregiving research, we decided that we would ask the identical question to family caregivers and ask them if family caregiving was the most stressful life experience that they've ever had. And the percent came in surprisingly at 68%. Now, the reason this is important is that our culture has basically accepted the fact that widowhood is one of the most stressful events that people will ever experience. But it's not always easy to get on the radar screen the similar attention to be paid to family caregiving. But that simple statistic of 68% of caregivers saying that this is the most stressful and difficult experience they've ever been in, I think is one that demands a lot of attention to this area. Related to this is that family caregiving basically impacts potentially every aspect of a caregiver's life. In fact, to make this point, what I'd like to do right now is to read to you just a couple of quotes that we identified in our research on family caregiving. And keep in mind as you listen to these quotes that I've obviously selected some that are the most extreme that draw attention to why we need to look more closely at caregivers and the use of respite. This first quote I shared with authors of human development textbooks, and they decided to publish this in their textbooks because in just a few short sentences it really demands attention for the topic of caregiving. This is a daughter who wrote about her caregiving experiences. And the quote is, "I worked the entire time through 4 pregnancies. returning to work within 6 weeks of delivery. It was a piece of cake compared to trying to cope with a combative, frustrated adult who cannot dress, bathe, or feed themselves, who wanders constantly. A person faced with this situation, having to work a full day, raise a family, and take care of an impaired relative, would be susceptible to suicide, parent abuse, and possibly murder. That, again, obviously is an extreme situation. Here's another quote from a wife who's a caregiver. "Certainly no one wants to be like this, and yet we are powerless to prevent it. I've considered that on my 60th birthday, I should drive a car at high speed into a concrete wall." And another wife who reports about the difficulties of the ups and downs of dealing with her husband's dementia. "One day my husband feels great. The next day he can hardly get out of bed. One day he's going to get his business going again. The next he wants to kill himself. He's highly depressed. He was a workaholic and highly intelligent. He was a leader in his church and a well-respected salesman, but is now unable to communicate or to be the husband like he was. It's pure hell and will not get any better." And then finally, one that's not quite so extreme, because my intent is not to depress all of the listeners today. This is another wife who wrote, "I still feel that there's a lot to live for if I could just get a chance to spread my wings." I think a lot of listeners who are the caregivers could relate to that particular quote. Another reason for focusing in on respite care, in addition to just the quality of life that caregivers experience, is that those of you who are listening today who come from provider agencies, community service providers, certainly are well aware of the fact that respite providers feel a great obligation to be accountable for providing evidence that their services work. And it's definitely an important aspect of their work to be able to document that so that they can continue getting future sources of funding. So in short, after about 20 years of research on respite services and outcomes associated with that, primarily looking at benefits to family caregivers, my conclusion is, and many others would agree, that there are no real whopper effects that we've yet identified. Perhaps the single most accurate way to describe this whole set of research is that the research is inconclusive, it's somewhat inconsistent, and the most favorable conclusion would be the effects of respite have been modest at best. So again, additional work remains to be done to document the effectiveness of respite. Now, I'd like to turn briefly to a research article that was published back in 1998 by one of the leading researchers at that time. Is Steve Zarat and 3 other colleagues published an article in the Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry. And in that article, there were a couple of these 4 conclusions that came from that article and has been supported by future research as well. But this helps explain why respite has not shown the whopper effects in the research that all of us would like to be able to see. And first, respite, or Steve Zarat pointed out that far too many caregivers wait way too long in their caregiving careers before they consider using respite services. So it's too much to expect when people start using it too late. And then also when you look at a couple of other items on that slide, not only delay in the use of it, but then not using it often enough. It's difficult to believe that anything could really have the profound whopper effects when too many caregivers use it too late. Secondly, Steve Zarat's article, and I think it makes it one of the most valuable articles in this whole set of research, is that he clearly identified that in order for respite to be effective, it needs to be used regularly. He goes so far as to say regular needs to be twice a week. And so I think that's pretty much a prescription that we should write for most caregivers, is that at a minimum, you should try to get respite twice a week. And then borrowing from the medical profession, their use of the term dosage, which makes a lot of sense in this arena, is that in order for respite to be effective, you've got to have it not only often enough, but in sufficient amounts when you do get respite. And Steve Zarat also recommends that you get respite in blocks of time at a bare minimum of 2 hours for each time that you use respite. I would suggest far more than 2-hour blocks of time, but this is a very good beginning in terms of helping us do a better job of making respite more effective. And then finally, there are obviously a number of other very worthwhile community services that caregivers need to use, not just respite, but to get the education they need to participate in social support groups or counseling services, to have time for leisure activities and so forth. I would hope that in the coming years ahead that respite providers see their intervention as not just a single component intervention, that respite is different from most other services in that it can allow the time that caregivers may need to be able to use other services. So when you package respite along with other services, then I think we're going to see more significant and positive findings from respite. However, I think there's some other pieces that are missing. And I'm somewhat disappointed that other researchers have not really come to an agreement yet to examine more carefully what caregivers do with respite time. But first of all, one of the questions is what might be missing from these respite investigations. Now, what led us to believe that we need to look at more respite time was when we asked caregivers in our research studies if they, to what extent they were satisfied with the use of their respite time. We expected that most caregivers would say, well, of course, I'm very satisfied. However, what we found surprisingly was that 46% of these caregivers reported that they were only somewhat or not very satisfied with how they spent their time. Caregivers who used their respite for employment were a bit more satisfied with the respite time because they used their time for work. The non-employed caregivers are the ones that needed a lot more attention about how to identify ways to make their respite more effective. What you're looking at on the screen is one of those slides that I'll just mention very briefly, and that is my research recently regarding the use of respite time. There's 2 key articles that I and my colleagues at the University of Utah authored, and they both appeared in the Journal of Applied Gerontology. The first one that you're looking at now came out in 2009, where we simply described what caregivers did with their respite time and then also correlated that with some outcomes that I'll mention in just a minute. In addition to that particular article, we also published another article just more recently. I think it came out just in the last couple of months. And the title of this article is The Benefits of Respite Time Use, a comparison of employed and non-employed caregivers. One thing that's unique in this article is that while many organizations don't view paid employment as respite, we are able to find some suggestions for caregivers who are employed to find ways at work so that they can make their work a little bit more like a respite experience. So I think that's a very valuable article to take a look at. Now, the question of why are so many people dissatisfied with their respite time? Well, you look at these 5 points that summarize why caregivers were disappointed with respite time. Let me share with you some quotes that came from people who said they were very dissatisfied with their respite time, and see if you cannot see how their comments fit into these patterns. One caregiver said simply, I need to organize my time better to do hobbies. Another caregiver said, I want more time to spend at home alone. Another caregiver, and this one surprisingly is very common, I wasted my time watching television. and I know I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but if caregivers don't plan ahead for what they plan to do with their respite time, many of them end up watching television, and I believe ended up being a little bit more depressed after watching television at home and not doing something else that might have been better for themselves. Another caregiver wrote, "I wish I could have relaxed, but I had to help others and make visits." Another caregiver wrote, "I'm annoyed with having to spend so much time on housework." And then finally another one wrote, "I never seem to be able to do what I want." So in short, there are many caregivers who use respite, but we make a mistake if we assume that the caregivers automatically engage in activities that are to their betterment. In fact, many caregivers who don't plan or don't know how best to spend their time end up spending their time in ways that may actually generate even more stress. So we shouldn't just assume that respite's automatically going to lead to better outcomes. We need to look at more carefully what caregivers do when they have respite time. So the 5 points that you see on the slide now are: poor advanced planning is one of the reasons for dissatisfaction. Wasted time and opportunity, especially when many caregivers believe this was a great opportunity and they missed the opportunity to do something very beneficial. Far too many caregivers spend all of their time on obligatory activities. Those are the things like house cleaning or shopping, but some people could consolidate that time and use their time more effective. And then finally, there's a huge inconsistency. When caregivers are asked, like we did in our study, we gave them a list of 23 activities and we said, take a look at this list. Let us know which activities you would like to do during respite and how much time you'd like to spend. And then we asked them to look at the same list and asked, what activities below did you engage in and how much time? And we concluded in these articles that we published that there was a surprisingly high degree of inconsistency. So it points directly to the need for better planning, better assessment for what caregivers should do when they have respite time. And then number 5, finally, some caregivers did things that created more stress. I think everybody listening knows somebody who's almost the world's best caregiver, and when they're caregiving to one person, they're not available to care for another. And when the friend network realizes this person's got some respite time, they get them on the phone, and that world's best caregiver is now providing some assistance and care to someone else. That's just one example of probably not the best use of respite time. Why is this inconsistency between the desired and the actual use of time important? Because by itself, it doesn't mean that it's that critically important. However, as we report in those articles that I mentioned, when caregivers had a high degree of inconsistency between what they desired and what they actually did with their time, we found that that inconsistency was associated with higher depression levels, less satisfaction with caregiving, and also higher burden scores, especially with respect to specific types of burden. Now, on the screen, you're looking at a cover page of a brochure that I wanted to mention that is available to anyone, and you have permission to make as many copies as you'd like. But this is now in its 4th edition. My colleagues in Utah initially started this brochure, but basically the purpose of this brochure was to educate caregivers about the importance of respite services. And then we learned enough that we began to, in future editions, give more advice on what to do with their respite time. I'm actually more proud of this publication than I am of the 100 journal article and book chapters that I've published in professional journals, because it has such practical value. This brochure contains much of the information that I'm including in today's presentation. And then I'm pleased to report that I got funding from our university here at Cal State San Bernardino to also publish this document in Spanish. So that's just barely hot off the press, but here's the English version that you're looking at, but there's also a version in Spanish. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. Now, before I get any further, I should pause at least briefly and see if there are any questions that any of you have up to this point, because it's very important at this point that we pause just briefly, because this is the time where I've tried to convince you of the importance of looking at respite, and especially what caregivers do with their respite time.
I do have one that was submitted, and they asked, how do you get the money to pay for respite for 2 days a week? I currently have a program that only pays a respite provider $1,000 a year.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. There might even be listeners that probably have a better answer than I do, but I know my work in the field of gerontology often ends up concluding trying to identify volunteers that can help provide respite. Just one brief example, there are a number of religious organizations besides just communities that are beginning to organize respite services. So if that's not already available in a church where a caregiver belongs, that's something that might be worth starting up. Also, places of employment. I don't know if there's any possibility of requesting any subsidies for respite services. I know that human resource offices need to be more creative in finding ways to help caregivers access respite, and especially providing financial support for it, in addition to just maternity benefits, for example, for younger women who are in the workforce. I don't know if that is a full and complete answer to that question, but it's certainly an important one. Were there other questions?
I have one more. How do you define respite?
The way I define respite is primarily time away from caregiving. When we were working on the Spanish version of the respite brochure, that was an issue, because in Spanish, respite can either mean time to breathe, or it could be more of a relaxation. And so different cultures have different meanings for respite, but basically it's time away to have an opportunity to do something other than providing caregiving services. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, one of the points that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is that in this field of caregiving, we frequently use the word caregiver burden. And when we first started doing research on caregiving, burden, the scales that we used to measure burden were quite primitive. This takes us back to about 1980, so that's roughly 31 years ago. But most people then thought burden, you were either high or low on burden. And then we started to distinguish between objective and subjective burden. So objective burden was simply the list and amount of time, list of activities and amount of time that you objectively had to do as a caregiver. But more importantly, we found the subjective aspects of burden to be very problematic and relevant, and that is, how burdened does someone feel? Because you may not be doing as much objective caregiving as someone else, but you may actually feel more burdened than the other person. But the one scale that we like to use in our research came out in 1989, and the one reason we like that so much is that there's 5 different subscales or 5 different dimensions of caregiver burden. And this is important because some caregivers are not burdened as much, say, by time. They may have more assistance from other people, but they may be very high in the emotional aspects of it. Emotional burden would have to do with the feelings of guilt and anger and resentment, or even things like watching a loved one sort of deteriorate if it's a progressive type of disorder. Some caregivers may be very high in the social burden, where the biggest problem is that they no longer have time to do things, the social activities that they used to engage in. Other caregivers may be very high in physical burden, and that is they're caring for someone that's physically very difficult, either their size or the challenges of their caregiving situation. And then finally, there's one that's quite unique, and that is a developmental burden. An example of this would be a woman whose children have just now grown and left the home, and that mother now feels like it's time to do some hobbies and do some things that she's always enjoyed, and now suddenly she's thrown into the experience of caregiving for her parents or even her husband's parents. And so that's an off-time kind of developmental burden. So I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that burden is a multidimensional variable, and that people can be high or low in different components of it. That's important because when we're trying to find advice to give caregivers concerning what they should do with their respite time, this is one of the best places to begin in doing an assessment that helps identify whether the caregiver needs more time in respite to deal with their social losses, or maybe during respite time they need to do something to deal more with the emotional aspects. If you're highly burdened emotionally, you may need professional counseling. If you're highly burdened socially, maybe it's just simply getting back in touch with some social relationships with people that you used to interact with that you no longer do. So we recommend that a careful assessment be done with each caregiver, beginning with a burden scale where you identify the types of burden they experience, and then directly try to find activities that deal with the specific burdens that each individual caregiver is experiencing. Now, at this point in the presentation, we're really talking about the actual intervention to help caregivers know what to do with their respite time and how to do some things to ensure that that would happen. And I just want to briefly mention a couple of things. One is, for those who like pictures of the relationships of variables, what you're looking at here is a figure that comes from a grant proposal that I'm working on now, where at the bottom of this chart says an intervention to improve respite time use. And basically what we're proposing is a good thorough assessment followed by goal setting and then monitoring of the goal attainment. And we expect that intervention to have some direct and indirect effects, but ultimately we want to improve the caregiver's overall well-being, as you can see in the box at the far right on the screen. But we also expect to immediately impact the satisfaction that caregivers have with their respite time. But I don't want to get too tied up in charts or statistics here. We need to include basically an examination of what caregivers do when they have respite time. There's a couple of questions I can answer real quickly here. We started out in our research thinking that there would be specific activities that would be universally beneficial to all caregivers, and we didn't find that to be the case. In other words, some caregivers need more rest, other caregivers don't. Some caregivers need nutrition and exercise advice, others don't. Some need assistance with maintaining a marriage and others don't. So what is most needed by each caregiver has to be done at an individual level. And I think that's another problem with much of our research, is that we provide the same intervention to everyone, when what needs to be done is the interventions need to be tailored to the needs of each caregiver. The amount of discrepancy between desired and actual use of time is important, as well as the degree of satisfaction with respite time. So basically what I'm proposing is that caregivers, when they have respite time available, they need to do things that help reestablish or restore continuity in their life and set goals for the respite time. This is another set of 2 slides that basically just gives some additional information about the theories that are guiding this intervention. Continuity theory of aging is important because as you apply it to caregiving and respite, it basically says that people can better adjust to their own aging over their life course or to stressful life experiences if they minimize the degree of disruption to the things that they've always felt were important to who they are. So in terms of applying this to respite, we need to ask caregivers questions like what we identify in our respite brochure. What are some of the things that you've always enjoyed doing? Then each of these answers from the caregivers point in the direction of what to do to help them. What did you do before you became a caregiver but have not been doing that lately? Are there religious and spiritual meaning to you that should be addressed through respite time? How can we improve your satisfaction with caregiving? How can we reduce the stress that you might feel from caregiving? How can we increase your respite time is another question, and some people can and other caregivers can't. And then how can we encourage you to use your respite time more regularly? But those are kind of assessment questions that we need to be asking caregivers before we decide how to best help them. The other theory is from the field of psychology, but basically, in a nutshell, this theory says that in order to be effective in your adjustments, you need to be very selective in what aspects of your life you plan to work on. Once you're aware of that, you need to be very specific in setting goals that are realistic, that they're attainable, and to also deal with potential obstacles to meeting those goals. If anyone listening is familiar with this goal setting and goal attainment literature, you know this very well, that people need to remove obstacles to goal attainment. So if someone is not going to encourage you to play golf during your respite time, don't ask them for permission to do so. So you're basically trying to remove obstacles that would interfere with your goal attainment. With respect to, there's some other information we'll come back to in just a minute about specific outcomes. But I've been asked to identify some key features to what I think should be included in research and evaluation for respite. Number one, I think we need to select a broader range of outcomes, and I'll mention a couple of those in just a minute. Instead of just looking at caregiver burden, caregiver depression, or life satisfaction, we need to be more realistic when we identify the outcomes, because if you are a program provider and you say you want to make respite result in greater life satisfaction, you're going to set the program up for failure, because no respite program that I'm aware of is so powerful and so effective that you can change a person's entire review of their life. But what's more realistic is, can you change the satisfaction that they have with their daily life? Now that's a much more realistic outcome. We also need to make sure that we match program-specific goals with outcomes. So those who are listening today who provide respite services, I would encourage you to take a look at your mission statements and your goal statements, and that should guide you in the direction of what kind of outcome measures you should have. So that if you say a goal is to restore family functioning, then you need to have outcomes that measure your program's ability to deal with that instead of depression or some other outcome. So take a careful look at the goals and mission statement of a program and match them with outcomes if you plan to measure them. In this process, you may even realize that maybe you need to even change some aspects of a mission statement, or perhaps even the goals and objectives of an organization. We need to select outcomes that are targeted to individual caregiver needs, so that if I was a caregiver and needed to return to the golf course or playing tennis with friends, then the outcomes need to measure that and not always just depression and morale. For researchers, we need to focus on intervention studies where we test ways to make interventions more effective for people. We don't need more studies that say, are caregivers stressed, and how are caregivers stressed? We know that, and we know it very well, and it's time to move on to doing studies of best practices, for example. I encourage everyone, whether it's program evaluation of your service or whether it's a researcher, to share their findings with others. This again would be your best practices. Share it in newsletters, share it in magazines, share it at presentations. We've got to get the word out about what's working and what's not working. And then finally, we need to be far more creative and think out of the box in the way that we're providing interventions and how we assess their outcomes. Now, again, I don't have time to go through all of these, but these are slides that you can return to at your leisure or preference to see whether or not you might want to include some of these as you assess the outcomes of your programs. So there's physical health outcomes of the caregiver, mental health outcomes, but they need to go beyond just the outcomes of the caregivers. It could be situational aspects, family relationships. What impact is respite having for work? Does respite make it possible to be at work more hours a week, or what is it doing to your work productivity? And then again, I've identified on this slide programs and their own objectives and their mission statements, and to try to match the outcomes with the goals of the individual organization. And then, of course, the goals of the individual caregiver that I mentioned before. And then finally, regarding policy recommendations, now I know how difficult it is to implement and to move in translational research into making policy recommendations, but these are some key features that I think need to be part of our public policy, and some are already well in place and others are less so. But we need to do whatever we can to enhance caregivers' control over the decision making, so that we inform them all along the way. We remind them what impact caregiving is having on them, but they can make good informed decisions. We need services that are very flexible to match the circumstances and preferences of caregivers. We need, obviously, to make it convenient and affordable. And again, as I said before, respite needs to be seen as a multi-component service and not just time away. The time away gives caregivers an opportunity to engage in other services that can double or triple the impact, the positive impact of respite. And again, we need, if we have outcomes, we need to make sure they're realistic and measurable. We need, this is an ideal that I would have, is that every respite provider have some sort of a component to their service that begins with an educational component that says, somewhat like what we do in the brochure, respite's potentially the most important service you could ever use. Take it seriously. Look at some of the suggestions that we have in this brochure and do everything you can to make your respite time as effective as possible to maximize the outcomes. And then finally, in policy, we need, again, to encourage others to share in the best practices. So in conclusion, I would simply say, let's not only consider how we can become better professionals and more effective caregivers, but let's give some consideration to ourselves and apply this message to our own lives. I would ask the question of everyone listening today, do you have continuity in your life that is desired continuity? Are you doing the things that have basically made you who you are? How far astray are you from engaging in those activities? So in short, I hope I've stimulated some of your thoughts, and we do have a few minutes for some questions and answers.
Do we have any more questions, Emily?
Yes, I'm gathering them now. So how do you encourage caregivers to do more satisfying activities? I'm the program director for 3 Alzheimer's day centers and work with many caregivers.
I think the first obstacle is just right up front, recognizing that most caregivers don't want to think selfishly. So they don't think naturally about, well, what is it that I need to do that will make me happier? So they need to be confirmed that that's a legitimate experience. In fact, that is why respite largely exists, is that we want to improve the quality of life of the caregivers. I think sometimes by showing examples or asking the right questions to probe For example, in the respite brochure, I think the most poignant question is there something that you used to do that was very enjoyable and made you happy? And it may take a while for you to think about how long ago this was, but what is that you used to do? And I think that, provokes a lot of emotion when the caregiver recalls, well, I always used to enjoy reading, or I enjoyed hiking, but it's been so long ago that they don't naturally think of those things. So I think part of the answer is asking the people the right kinds of questions so that they can see the obvious sort of aha moment. They nod their head and go, yeah, okay, now I think I know what you're talking about. But some of it has to get over the fact that many of them are going to feel guilty about doing anything that looks selfish.
Has any research looked at the benefit of respite that is planned activity, like fun days scheduled during the year, or a special event like a caregiver dinner or retreat?
Excellent question. To my knowledge, research has only asked, there might be descriptions of some of these events, but I don't see any research that's asking to look at how those events created different outcomes. In fact, that's exactly what I'd like to see more of in future research, is if you think you're doing some activities that really make a difference, then let's ask caregivers to see whether those events are enhancing the quality of their daily life and not just depression or even burden levels. I think the most desired outcome measure that I would recommend would be to ask caregivers, both before you do something to help them and after, to what extent do you enjoy or you're satisfied with your daily life? And those kinds of activities you just mentioned are more than likely to have an impact on that. They may not take depression away, but they're definitely going to have an effect on daily life. But in short, the answer is research has not really examined those other than just simply describing them.
Did your study determine whether there are a difference in satisfaction of time spent between caregivers who self-direct their respite care, choosing who, when, where, how much, and those who are offered respite care, a specific provider, time, day, and even place, caregiver-driven versus provider-driven?
No, we've not been able to do that. I think that's very worthwhile to include sort of that whole mix of different variables that you mentioned. One of the obstacles to doing that is that you need a large sample of people so that you've got adequate numbers of people doing similar kinds of things so that you could statistically look at and compare the differences. But again, that's a perfect example of the kind of research that we need to be doing in the future. Now, I might add at this point, I've worked with colleagues who said, 20 years of research on family caregiving, I think we know everything we need to know. And I don't think those people could be further mistaken. The fact that we've now got a 31-year history of research on caregiving, there's still many questions that I don't think have ever been asked.
This is Jill Kagan. Do you mind if I respond to that last question just very briefly? Mm-hmm. Especially related to the consumer direction aspect of respite. I think some of our colleagues at the Family Caregiver Alliance have actually studied that and did find that consumer-directed respite was much more satisfying to family caregivers than provider-directed respite. And I think we've seen some of that also in our Oklahoma Lifespan Respite Program, which is largely consumer-directed respite. So the providers have the ability to hire providers of their own choosing, when they want to use them, how they want to use them, who they want to use. And that probably also, to some extent, frees up what it is they can do with their time as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you added that.
Go ahead. I've had a couple of people comment and asking if you use the tailored care assessment and what your feelings are about it.
We've not used that, so it'd be difficult for me to comment on that one.
Okay. what objective persons in what settings do you think are best positioned to help assess caregiver situations? And what would successful respite look like for them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question too, because in our research study we're dealing with what kind of qualifications should the caregivers have. One key qualification is that obviously if they don't have a very extensive background in caregiving, you've got to provide more training. But oddly enough, there's some people that have worked out in the caregiving arena. In fact, I know of one particular case that was startling, where there was a research or a staff member at a respite provider service who basically made family caregivers feel guilty when they dropped off their family member and then said to the staff they were going to go on a family vacation. This sort of signified the problem that whoever these facilitators are doing the assessments, they've got to have an appreciation and value for respite services so that they don't convey attitudes that are counterproductive. But I think there's a variety of people who've worked in caregiving capacities, and then obviously with a little bit of research experience or simply knowing where some of these scales are. I don't think it would be overly demanding that should prevent people from being able to do these assessments. We include in that respite brochure two assessment materials that I think would be useful, and that is that burden inventory, but also a satisfaction with caregiving. And combined, those two particular scales really identify people at risk for burnout who need probably additional respite time and maybe even more guidance in what they should do. I did fail to mention before, and I just now sort of allude to it, that research and assessing outcomes on caregiving shouldn't only assess the negatives. Most of the researchers now include scales that provide assessments of satisfaction with caregiving, because it's not all a negative situation. But if there are questions that don't adequately get dealt with here, I'd be happy to respond to individuals after this broadcast too, because I'm sure as soon as the broadcast ends, I'm going to think of other things I wish I had said. So please feel free to get in touch with me if that's the case.
One person writes that most caregivers that they work with need to use their respite time to go shopping, go to the doctor for themselves, etc. With only 2 2-hour breaks, how can they come up with time to do those fun activities?
Well, I think it'd be dependent on what those fun activities were. It could be that maybe you could add an element of fun to even some of those so they're not as painful. For example, if it was shopping, is there someone else that you could invite to go shopping with you? Even if it's a grocery store, it gives you an opportunity to have conversation in the car ride to the store, at the store, after the visit. So there might be opportunities to find ways to find some pleasure to those activities that you feel are obligatory. Another would be if you feel obligated to have an ultra clean house and you have to be the one to clean it, well, I would have a conversation and say, is there a way you could get someone else to clean the house instead of you, so that that hour that you would have spent in house cleaning, or 2 hours, you could have gone out and taken a hike or visited a friend that you wanted to, or you went to a public park and read a book. So people need to rethink how obligatory some of these activities really are, and whether or not they can find ways to partner with others to help do those so that it would free up that respite time.
Another person writes, I'm a coordinator for a free respite program, and caregivers will say that they want services, but they'll change their mind at the last minute because their loved one doesn't want something. They don't want someone coming to do respite. Also, hospital, dismissal staff, churches are some of the places that she gives information to, but the amount of caregivers don't ask for respite.
Yeah, I think the respite brochure that we put together helps convince people that they really need to do everything they can to begin using respite. And then if they get to a point of goal setting, then some of the things you just mentioned become the obstacles. A facilitator or someone that's helping do the assessment needs to come up with some suggestions for how to overcome these particular obstacles, so that, you know, in order to be effective in achieving that goal, you've got to eliminate potential obstacles that are going to block that. But again, it's hard to give a short answer to that, but the answer really lies in that assessment of each individual. And again, I hope that people use that respite brochure as a strategy for encouraging caregivers to use respite. I think the ideal audience for that respite brochure are people who are contemplating using respite but haven't really yet taken the step, because that document was really basically put together to try to win them over to consider using respite, and then of course give them suggestions for what to do with their time.
Have you researched how disability affects respite care?
Personally, we've not examined that other than another national data set where we looked at people who were providing care to someone who was physically disabled. We didn't study the use of respite in that context, but we did identify that some caregivers were definitely relieved when the caregiving experience ended. But even when the person was highly disabled or there's a high degree of caregiving demands going on, even with the death of that person, the obligation and sort of the sense of burden didn't automatically disappear. So the problems don't just end with the death of an individual.
And I believe you may have briefly touched on this, but how do you define respite in your research? How broad or how narrow is your definition, and do you include home care in your definition?
Yeah, my definition is very broad, because our definition is basically it's any opportunity that you get as a caregiver to have time away from caregiving responsibilities. So that's pretty broad. It would include, you know, all kinds of opportunities. For example, whether paid employment is really respite or not. I know that for a lot of people it's not, but I really believe even though it may not be a clearly identified form of respite, I think there are ways to make your work be more like respite. For example, if you have 2 breaks of 15 minutes each and a lunch break, you now have an hour and a half that you could use where you're away from work and you're also away from the caregiving responsibilities. So I like the broader definition, but I know different organizations will define respite differently. And so home care definitely would be something I would consider as a source of respite.
One of the events that their group is planning is a caregiver forum, and it sounds like some information that would be very important to share with them is, are you willing to share the questionnaire that you use?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I don't know of other researchers that are more open about sharing documents, but for sure we put a lot of work into questionnaires, and I'd be happy to make those available to whoever would like to use them. But at the same time I say that, I would encourage anyone that if they're trying to assess outcomes for what they do, that they give some careful thought to using developing questions and outcome measures that are very specific to what they're doing, and not always rely on just the standardized scales that measure things like depression that you may not easily change. So when you borrow items from researchers, you frequently get those standardized scales, and when I share my documents, I would hope that people wouldn't use them exclusively, that they would try to do some creative thinking and identify some very measurable goals of what they're doing. But yes, I'd be happy to share those documents.
And do you know of any research on sleep deprivation among caregivers and respite satisfaction?
No, other than I know it's in there. In fact, I've done some research where we've included those questions, and also in widowhood research. So I guess the only thing I can really say is that I know that sleep disturbance is something that is definitely problematic, and that I recommend that people get professional help, because you can't go night after night being sleep deprived and then do an adequate job as a caregiver. So something very specific like that warrants careful attention and to get some assistance on.
And that's it. I have a lot of questions asking for the articles that were referenced in the presentation, as well as the brochure, and I'll make sure that we address those after the webinar and send that out.
Okay, because the brochures are available at the Cal State University San Bernardino website, largely through the sociology department, and then a link to me as a faculty member, it's there. But we want to make this as convenient as possible for people to access those, and certainly encourage them to make as many copies and distribute them the way they'd want. And then the articles should be available as well online.
We have had a bit of trouble with the journal getting permission to replicate those articles, or even making them available online, though the link to the brochure is available on the ARCH website, as well as Dr. Lund's university site, and we sent that out previously. I assume that if people really wanted a copy of the article, Dr. Lund, maybe they could write to you directly and get a reprint?
Yeah, I think it's fine, yeah, to distribute them that way.
Okay. Were there any other questions, Emily?
Yeah, I had a couple come in as we were talking.
Oh, okay. People are still willing. If you're still willing to stay on, Dr. Lund, we'll
Sure, yeah, I'm still here.
We've got a high attendance rate, so.
Is the assessment of caregivers you seem to recommend, is it similar to person-centered planning?
I probably should know more about person-centered planning, but it probably is. What I highly recommend is an assessment that goes beyond just the individual, but includes their circumstances. Because sometimes, you know, the solution isn't just what the caregiver does. It may involve other individuals as well. I know that's not a very good answer to that question, but it probably is fairly similar.
Again, at the Family Caregiver Alliance website, there's quite a bit of information on caregiver assessment there. They have their own materials they've developed, as well as some sample assessment tools. And if Sean is still on the phone, he might want to talk about that, about what FCA has available on caregiver assessment. And several of our lifespan respite programs also are developing specific assessments related to respite need.
I think one of the most simple and most important questions of all is, what have you given up during your time as a caregiver that you used to enjoy and got a great deal of satisfaction from? It seems to be a probe that really gets people to thinking at the personal level of things that may, if they re-engaged in it, restored sort of that aspect of who they are, they can continue doing a lot of caregiving as long as they realize that they're continuing essential features of who they are.
This is Sean from Family Caregiver Alliance. I just wanted to echo what Jill said. If you go to our website, caregiver.org, and you do caregivers count 2, that will bring up a lot of our information around assessments.
Thank you, Sean.
And
it's good to work within a team, isn't it?
Yeah.
One last question is, they would like to know what age group of caregivers were targeted in the research.
The age of our caregivers was not as important as the age of the care recipient. It's largely because of the focus that we had on gerontology and older adults. So the caregivers in our studies could be as young as 18, but the person they provided the care to was usually age 50 and older. But that varied according to the different study. But the two articles that I mentioned in this presentation were both pretty broad range of age, but the care recipient was age 50 and above.
Was that the last question, Emily?
That was the last question. Oh, hold on.
One more.
Is there any research that shows that making a caregiver education and support group available in conjunction with respite, that quality of life is improved with that combination?
Well, there's a set of research studies that were called REACH, R-E-A-C-H. These were specific intervention studies that were designed for caregivers who were caring for somebody with dementia. But I'm more familiar with that set of research studies. There was a set called REACH 1 and REACH 2, and there were about 7 different universities who participated in all these interventions. And in the second set, they had to have more than one type of intervention combined with it. I don't recall offhand if in the REACH 2 studies that they specifically looked at support groups, but I doubt that there's a lot of research that would show that in conjunction with something else. But in my own research, we have looked at the role of support groups and what kind of outcomes it creates for caregivers. And there's something interesting that happens that we need to be aware of, because potentially some of that research doesn't conclude that support groups were helpful. But here's why. For example, if you send someone to a support group and it's early in their caregiving career, and they go to a support group that has a lot of members that are well into the caregiving career, if you take dementia for an example, if someone just found out their spouse has Alzheimer's disease and they go to one of these groups, and most of the conversation is on what they're likely to see in the next 5 or 6 years, they can actually feel more depressed because they went to the meeting. So when researchers go in and get their data, they see that this particular caregiver showed an elevation of depression. But that has to be interpreted. So what I'm saying is the research on support groups has to be interpreted very carefully, that it has to take into account what goes on in a group. And what usually goes on is there's affirmation, or that what they're feeling is okay, that they're encouraged to express it. And sometimes that looks in research to inflate negative outcomes. So we need to be really careful when we're doing the research on support groups and then how we interpret the findings. I hope that made sense, that short description, but support groups can play a very important role, especially in conjunction with other services, but the research doesn't always show that because of some of the reasons I just mentioned.
Is that the last question?
I believe so.
While we're waiting to see if one last question would come in, I wanted to just address briefly one of the very first questions that came in during the presentation about being able to afford more than 1 hour of respite per week, which for many, many family caregivers is probably the largest obstacle. We do know from the National Caregivers, from the National Alliance on Caregiving and the ARP study that they did in 2009, close to 90% of family caregivers are not getting respite at all. And we know it's not just the affordability issue. There are other barriers as well. But we're really hoping, and the goal of our Lifespan Respite state grant programs is to begin to deal with all of the barriers that keep families from accessing respite to begin with. And certainly one of them is the cost issue. And given the huge state budget cuts that are happening right now, and perhaps the even more devastating federal cuts that are on the horizon, I really think that we still need to look to our lifespan respite programs for creativity here, because they're really charged with collaborating with other state agencies and with the private sector to begin to build some partnerships that will hopefully maybe make some funding available.
Yeah, I think you hit the key word.
Dollars that are there.
Yeah, I think the key word that went off as I'm listening to your comment was the partnerships. And I teach classes on caregiving, and one of the conclusions is that part of the solution is that it's too big of a deal for one person to do all the caregiving, and that caregivers need to be able to form partnerships with other family members, volunteers in the community. I know it's not easy, but many family members will say, hey, give me a call, I'll be glad to help, and then when you do call, they're not readily available. But caregivers need to be persistent, and if somebody's offering help, try to take them up on that. And then at a more macro level, I've always tried to encourage businesses and religious groups and governments and, you know, every potential sizable organization potentially has something to contribute toward a solution for the magnitude of these problems that we experience. And being creative at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And we hope our lifespan state programs will have some role in facilitating some of that too.
Mm-hmm.
Any last questions?
I did have one more come in.
Okay.
Do you know what research has been done on respitality model?
Respitality models?
Are you familiar? That model is has been promoted by United Cerebral Palsy, largely, that gives families an opportunity to spend a weekend at a hotel, get away with, you know, sort of a mini vacation.
I'm not aware of any research on that, more than just a description of a program.
Yeah.
Research is really lagging behind, you know, some of the creative ways that people are finding respite.
Well, we're getting close to finishing out our time, and I want to thank Dr. Lund very, very much for a very provocative and very thoughtful and extremely helpful presentation, for joining us today and making all of his materials so readily available. Again, we will help facilitate, make some of those materials available, and feel free to give any of us at ARCH a call or email us at those addresses. If you think of questions later you'd like to have asked, please let us know. And stay tuned for our next webinar, which tentatively is scheduled for sometime at the end of July. So keep that last week of July open for these wonderful webinars. And once you disconnect from this webinar today, you will see an evaluation pop up. Again, if you take just a few seconds to complete that, we'd be very grateful. And thank you, Dr. Lund, very, very much. It was excellent.
Well, thanks for inviting me to do this. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.